I need to start this video by saying, I am not British. Also, it seems like the Metropolitan Police kinda suck, but they have a concrete definition of what a war crime is. And since this video is about the war crimes of the Street Fighter 6 cast, that is what I am going with. Okay, so after doing a bit more research, one of the rules set out by the Metropolitan Police is to not breach the Geneva Conventions. And every other rule they have is already covered by the Geneva Conventions, as well as one of the rules in the IHL, we'll get to that, being to not violate the Geneva Conventions. But I really like starting this video by saying I'm not British, so the intro is staying. But just know that for the sake of this video, if an action breaches the Geneva Conventions as laid out by the IHL, it is a war crime. Now, luckily for me, the International Committee of the Red Cross has collected, in their own words, a comprehensive but not exhaustive list of rules in the Geneva Conventions and compiled them into a database known as the Customary International Humanitarian Law. This should cover everything, but if I have missed or misinterpreted anything, blame the United States education system. Couple more disclaimers, don't worry, it's just two more. I'll start talking about the actual war crimes soon. First, for the sake of not having everyone always committing war crimes, I will consider anyone who has willingly entered a battle with anyone else to be combatants. And second, I am not some kind of lore keeper for Street Fighter. Street Fighter 6 is the first Street Fighter game I've ever played. I did do some research on each of the characters for this video, obviously, but some things from different medias directly contradict each other, with the comics saying different things than the cartoons saying different things than the games. So I tended to use the in-game lore for each character, and as long as the non-game media did not directly contradict what was said in the game, I brought some and accounted for some of those actions as well. So, without further ado, let us start with Aki. Hey, it's me. Further ado. A lot of people in this series destroyed dojos, and while these could be considered cultural property and would therefore constitute a war crime under Rule 38 of the IHL, attacks against cultural property, for the sake of this video, since I'm considering the default state of the fighters to be enemy combatants, I will also consider the dojos of these fighters to be military objectives, which, also under Rule 38, allows damage to said cultural property if they are military objectives. Okay? Well, I'm actually done with the intro this time. So, Aki. So Aki is a really easy one. Rule 72 of the IHL states that the use of poison or poisoned weapons is prohibited. That's kinda Aki's whole thing, but it is not her only war crime, as she has been known to use, in her own words, pain and unbridled fear to get her, or more accurately Fang's, way. This to me sounds a lot like torture, which is prohibited under Rule 90 of the IHL, stating, torture, cruel, or inhuman treatment, and outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliating and degrading treatment, are prohibited. And while I would not necessarily consider this particularly humiliating or degrading, it is definitely cruel and almost surely torture. Now, Akuma kills a lot of people. Like, most of the people that he fights end up dead, at least in his early years, starting with his, well, I guess former master. However, the fighters that Akuma kills tend to willingly enter combat with him, so I'm kinda on the fence about considering this a war crime. So I don't think that Akuma kills any civilians, but it is possible, if not likely, that the people he fights don't know that they are entering a fight to the death. And if any of them try to surrender and he still killed them, that would violate Rule 47C of the IHL, which states, attacking, anyone who clearly expresses an intention to surrender, provided they abstain from any hostile act and do not attempt to escape, is prohibited. Akuma also fights Gen, despite him being sick, which could violate Rule 47B of the IHL, attacking anyone who is defenseless because of unconsciousness, shipwreck, wounds, or sickness is prohibited, although this likely would not count as a war crime, since despite being sick, Gen is by no means defenseless. Akuma also, to some extent, psychologically tortures Ryu in an attempt to awaken the Satsui no Hado within him. However, in true American fashion, me, not Akuma, I'm going to consider this more enhanced taunting rather than torture. And finally, Akuma violates rules 43, 44, and 45 of the IHL, which all cover the protections of the natural environment when he destroys forests and islands just for fun, I guess? So Blanka. While Blanka does use lightning as one of his forms of attack, there are no direct rules against the use of electricity in combat. Blanka does not, as far as I can tell, use his lightning to torture anyone, which would violate Rule 90, and he seems to have some pretty good control over the electricity, so this abides by Rule 71, which states that the use of weapons which are by nature indiscriminate is prohibited. It also doesn't violate Rule 70, reading the use of means and methods of warfare which are of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering is prohibited, as, other than the mental distress of facing a Blanka who actually knows what Lightning Beast does in ranked, there is no unnecessary suffering. Now, Cammy was, in the past, a soulless doll working for Bison until the day that he would overtake her body as his own. Weird soul stuff. But during that time, she was tasked with many missions that, while illegal against citizens, were mostly against enemy combatants. There are, however, 2 that I could find confirmed cases of attacks on civilians. These are the assassination of Albert Sellers, which happens in one of the animated movies where they're all American for some reason, but he is a civilian, so this directly violates Rule 1 of the IHL, which states that attacks must not be directed against civilians. And the second event, a little bit more convoluted and potentially incorrect, is the kidnapping and or killing of Dorai. As I mentioned, this one's kind of confusing, as there are a ton of different timelines, and this is kind of like a common event, and most of them have Dorai either being captured or just otherwise missing, and the comics have Cammy doing so. So, depending on whether or not Dorai is alive, this could either be rules 98 and 99, if he is alive, which are the rules surrounding enforced disappearance and the deprivation of liberty, or, if he's dead, another classic Rule 1. And, while I did say that the comics were what have Cammy doing this kidnapping, and those same comics say that she killed him under direct order from Bison, I said that I would not use lore that directly contradicts the games. And the games have not yet confirmed whether Dorai is alive or dead, but they have confirmed that he has gone missing, and unless I'm missing something, have not said who did it, so I'm going to say it was Cammy. We also don't know if Bison's taunting of Chun-Li, saying that he killed her father, is the truth, in which case he is dead, and it might have been Cammy that did so, or if it's just him trying to rile her up. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter for this video, because as I said, I'm counting Cammy as at the very least doing the kidnapping, so it adds another war crime to the Cammy pile. Speaking of Chun-Li though, Chun-Li does get quite close to committing war crimes many times, however she never really crosses that line into war criminal. And honestly, getting close kind of just comes with the territory when you work for Interpol. DJ. While DJ does, like many other characters, get brainwashed by Bison at some point during the comics, as far as I can tell, he only fights against, in this case Bison's, enemy combatants. So, no war crimes for the only acceptable charge character. Dhalsim is probably the character that most unexpectedly has committed war crimes, and still does to this day. Dhalsim's war crime of choice is the use of incendiary weapons, which directly violates Rule 85 of the IHL, which states, the anti-personnel use of incendiary weapons is prohibited unless it is not feasible to use a less harmful weapon. Since Dhalsim can clearly incapacitate combatants with just his stretchy body, that is an alternative. There is a less harmful weapon. One point in Dhalsim's favor, though, not that it negates the war crime, is that he does not violate Rule 84, which states that if incendiary weapons are used, particular care must be taken to avoid, and in any event to minimize, incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. Dhalsim has very good control over his fire, and is known to be quite protective of civilians. The closest thing to a war crime that Edmund Honda has ever done is trying to join the IOC. Do not ask me any further questions. Surprisingly, despite being basically, well, not born, but kidnapped and raised for the sole purpose of war crimes, and also spending time with former... Wait, do war crimes have a statute of limitations? I don't think so. Anyway, he spends time with war criminals. Ed himself has seemingly not committed any war crimes, and even created a small organization to help some of the victims of the war crime organization. Though they named it basically the same thing, which, to each their own, I guess. Elena has, as far as I can tell, not committed any war crimes. She might even be part of the reason that Akuma commits less potential war crimes these days. As for Guile, while in the lore of the Street Fighter universe, he has not necessarily committed any war crimes, he is part of the American military, so it is more likely than not that some of his actions during his time in the service would be war crimes, but there are no concrete evidence. And Jamie? Well, Jamie's just an alcoholic, not a war criminal. Ah yes, Street Fighter's version of Dick Cheney. Originally, in a much more comedic and far less researched version of this script, that is all I had written for JP. However, he has actually committed war crimes. First of which being the bombings in Neyshal, which, while likely not falling under the rules against area bombardment, would definitely breach Rules 1, the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants, which states that attacks must not be directed against civilians. Rule 7, the principle of distinction between civilian objects and military objectives, which states that attacks must not be directed against civilian objects. Rule 11, indiscriminate attacks, which is exactly what it sounds like, and potentially many more depending on who died and what was destroyed in the bombings, including, but not limited to, medical personnel, religious personnel, medical transports, journalists, cultural property, and many more. But that's not all. Since JP, through the Amnesia organization, released fake footage of Ken being behind said bombings in Neyshal, it could be argued that the act of releasing this footage breaches Rule 62, improper use of the flags or military emblems, insignia, or uniforms of the adversary, as Ken is, in a way, his own uniform, or, more accurately, Rule 63, use of flags or military emblems, insignia, or uniforms of neutral or other states not party to the conflict, as Ken, the used uniform, is neither JP nor the civilians he bombed, which are the two parties to this conflict. And that's not even it for Neyshal. Separate to all of the potential damages and civilian deaths, we know that during the aftermath of the initial bombing, JP kills, or at the very least kidnaps, another civilian, Kimberly's uncle. This may fall under the previously mentioned Rule 1, if he is dead, or it could be one of the rules 96, for hostage-taking, 98, enforced disappearance, or 99, deprivation of liberty. This all depends on the exact civilian and life status of Kimberly's uncle. And, just in case you thought we were done with JP, we're not, but this will be short. JP was the head financial manager for Shadowloop, so any war crimes in the Bison section of this video can also, in part, be attributed to JP. Yuri kills a lot of people, and she does so under the order of one of the war crime organizations. But the people who she kills, as far as I can tell, are enemy combatants. This does not, however, justify her use of torture, violating Rule 90 of the IHL, which she seems to do just for fun. And I better not hear any of you saying that you can fix her. That's Chun-Li's job. Oh yeah, she also captures some of Bison's dolls, which, since they're not civilians, would probably be better classified as prisoners of war, and would not violate Rule 47B, which involves attacking unconscious warriors, because she doesn't really attack them necessarily, she kidnaps them. But what definitely violates Rule 47B is when she, effectively, kills a wounded Seth who is not attempting to fight back. Though she also brings him back later, so maybe she's morally in the clear. Pretty sure she doesn't intend to, though, so who knows. But legally, that's a war crime. Okay, Ken. Ken was brainwashed by Bison, but didn't really commit any war crimes under the war crime guy. He was just used to lure out Ryu. Significantly later, he was framed by JP, claiming Ken was behind the Neyshal incident. The dude can just not catch a break. And then, to top it all off, brainwashed by Bison, framed as a terrorist, He's the successor to a billion-dollar corporation, which isn't a war crime, but like, come on, you do not make that much money without some human rights violations. 2 in a row, we've got Kimberly and Lily, neither of which have existed long enough in the Street Fighter universe to commit any war crimes. Similar to Guile, Luke is former American military and also a former PMC, so very likely war crimes, but again, no evidence here. However, unlike Guile, Luke shoots a civilian. He shoots Kalima. He doesn't kill her, and it is because he thinks she's a terrorist, but he also thinks Ken is a terrorist for a bit and just yells at him. So, I don't know, maybe Luke just hates women. But, misogyny or not, war crimes are war crimes, and it's literally Rule 1 of the IHL, attacks must not be directed upon civilians. Also, in this case, Rule 134, stating the specific protection, health, and assistance needs of women affected by armed conflict must be respected, would not necessarily apply, as this rule, quote, recognizes the specific needs and vulnerabilities of women, and not getting shot applies to everyone. Also, another thing that I'm looking into now, after clarifying the timeline a little bit on like a second read through, Luke shooting her might happen after she becomes part of the Nashal resistance, in which case she would be considered an enemy combatant, and it would not be a war crime. But as I mentioned, the timeline is sometimes a bit fuzzy, and also it's really funny to say that Luke is a war criminal. Okay, a lot of these characters I wrote like little, jokes or like explained some of their story stuff, but Bison has just committed so many war crimes that I'm just going to read them out for you. So, first, Bison has kidnapped plenty of people. He's definitely taken and perhaps even killed hostages. All of this forced removal of people from their natural living states could be classified under Rule 96, which is hostage taking and directly says the taking of hostages is prohibited. It could fall under Rule 98, which is enforced disappearance, which states enforced disappearance is prohibited. Or it could fall under Rule 99, which states arbitrary deprivation of liberty is prohibited. Any 3 of those, depending on the civilian status and direct actions taken to move these people, but he's done so much of it. There's also an entire chapter, chapter 37, which is rules 118 through rules 128, which is just a list of rules on how you treat persons deprived of their liberty. And then after that, there's chapter 38, which is rules 129 through rules 133, which is more rules on the displacement of persons, but these are less likely to apply for Bison himself, as I don't think Bison necessarily takes entire civilian populations and moves them to other locations. He's more of a individual or small group kind of kidnapper, from what I could tell. Bison also, as you have heard before and will hear again, does a lot of brainwashing, which, if this is the brainwashing of enemy combatants, this would likely simply fall under Rule 90 of torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. However, if they are not prisoners of war, if they are not enemy combatants, then it could be argued that brainwashing civilians is a form of hostage taking, directly violating Rule 96. On top of all of the brainwashing, Bison is notorious almost for plenty of biological and psychological experiments, which could also fall under Rule 90 against torture, but the biological experiments specifically would fall under Rule 92, which states, mutilation, medical or scientific experiments, or any other medical procedure not indicated by the state of health of the person concerned and not consistent with generally accepted medical standards are prohibited. The rule is literally called mutilation and medical, scientific, or biological experiments. So that's another one stacked onto the pile. Bison's hosting of non-war competitions, the World Warrior tournaments, are, for the most part, used to lure out and capture Ryu, which means they are held in bad faith. This violates Rule 66, which is the rule non-hostile contacts between the parties to conflict, which states, commanders may enter into non-hostile contact through any means of communication, the World Warrior competitions. Such contact must be based on good faith, and they are clearly based in bad faith, with his intention being to lure out and capture Ryu. Hey, it's me from the editing booth. The editing booth is still just my room. I looked a little bit more into it, and a lot of the tournaments hosted by Bison are considered non-canon tournaments, but like they definitely seem like things that he would do. And even in that case, the second tournament, the second World Fighting Tournament, was hosted by Bison for that reason of, luring out Ryu. But there's also the Street Fighter 6 Martial Arts Fighting Tournament, which is sponsored by the Terra Network Partners, which is kind of like, that's JP's, another one of his organizations. I'm not going to lie, I didn't pay too much attention to the story of Street Fighter 6. I played the World Tour mode exclusively to unlock some second outfits for some characters I play. But if we're assuming that he's hosting this for other bad faith reasons, we can also add a violation of Rule 66 to JP. But at the very least, with the second World Fighting Tournament in Street Fighter 2, we can keep this on Bison. I just felt like I needed to clarify. We've also got a breach of Rule 11, indiscriminate attacks, as when Bison is almost taken down, instead he decides to blow up himself and everyone around him. Unsuccessfully, mind you. So that's quite indiscriminate, if you ask me. I would not necessarily consider this to be destruction of the natural environment set out in Rules 43, 44, and 45, because if I remember correctly, it happens in an industrial area. After that, we have a classic Rule 1, attacks against civilians are prohibited. M. Bison kills a lot of civilians, like so many civilians. And as a first in Street Fighter 6, M. Bison breaks Rules 136 and Rules 137, being, respectively, recruitment of child soldiers. Children must not be recruited into armed forces or armed groups. And participation of child soldiers in hostilities, stating children must not be allowed to participate in hostilities. Honestly, despite this being more war crimes than anyone else, it's a surprisingly small number for Bison, but what this video doesn't necessarily account for is how many times he does these. So despite only being 8, listen, he's a bad guy. The point is, M. Bison's not a good dude. Also has like the wildest body shape out there. Hey, what's up? Me again. Another break in the M. Bison section, though I guess this one's technically at the end. I was wondering why I said that. Why did I say he has a very weird body shape? Because I was looking at it and I was like, he really doesn't. He's a big dude, but he doesn't really have like a big, like a weird shaped body. And then I realized it is just in the one like Street Fighter 6 picture of him where I don't know if it's like mid inhale or something. It's this one that I'm putting on screen now. But his chest just looks so unbelievably large in this one image. Everywhere else he looks normal, but it's just in this one where his torso just looks like someone put like a scale on it, like they scaled it up in Photoshop. That's it. Mai has not committed any war crimes. Manon is not a war criminal. She is just French, which is not a war crime. As for Marisa, while it is not a war crime, she does want to marry Zangief for a bit, so yeah. But luckily she makes a significantly better choice at the end of her story, also after Zangief rejects her. So even though Rashid fights an injured Chun-Li, this would not be a war crime, as despite her being injured, these injuries do not make her defenseless, which is similar to Akuma's fight with a sick Gen. So once again, this does not meet the requirements for violating Rule 47B. This means that Rashid has not committed any war crimes. He's just a streamer, which in the world of Street Fighter is debatably worse. For Ryu, it could be argued that his final Shoryuken against Sagat caused superfluous injury. But for that to be a war crime, it has to be a weapon of a nature to cause superfluous injury. And Ryu has been shown that he can easily use his Shoryuken without causing such injuries, so the fight against Sagat was an outlier, not the nature. Other than that, Ryu has killed a few different people in different medias throughout the series, often, if not always, when temporarily taken over by the Satsui no Hado, but the people he kills are always enemy combatants. For example, a group of Sin scientists who would be considered combatants as they were directly aiding the military effort, as opposed to scientists or any other occupation who are simply supporting the war effort of their nation, which is a distinction that has historically allowed people to retain their civilian status. While Terry has not committed any war crimes per se, you've seen the ad, right? And I mean, that's gotta count for something. And finally, Zangief. As far as I can tell, Zangief has not committed any war crimes. Hey, thanks for watching. This video took a little bit longer to make than I expected because, as it turns out, reading about the atrocities of war, I can only do that for so long in any given day. But, and if you like the video, be sure to do all that YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe. I don't know, whose war crimes were your favorite? Oh, jeez. Great call to action there. And, stay tuned for my next video, which is going to be all of the times I violated OSHA regulations during my time working on construction sites. It's been more than 6 months since I last worked on a construction site, which means that they can't get me for it anymore.